Hello, hello, hello. Welcome back to Jen's Books. I hope you've had an amazing week. First of all, apologies. I'm sorry I've not posted anything for over a week. Work has just been bonkers, but that doesn't mean I haven't been reading. So I've got plenty of books to recommend and discuss with you. And my video after this one is going to be my September roundup. So it's a little bit delayed, but I've got some really great books to talk about in that. But this video felt like a bit of a challenge, to be honest. It was laid down by some of my subscribers, and that was to revisit Wuthering Heights. I did a Six on the Shelf video not so long ago where I talked about some classic 19th century novels that I really enjoyed and some that I didn't enjoy as much. And Wuthering Heights was one of the ones, and I knew it might be contentious, that I didn't really enjoy. So my background with Wuthering Heights, and I sort of mentioned this in the video, is I haven't read it for many years. I read it when I was doing my A-levels, I think, and we were given lists of classic novels that were recommended for us to read. And I think I'd probably already read Jane Eyre, which, you may know I really enjoy. And there was this idea of Wuthering Heights being a sort of passionate romantic novel. So when I read it, I think partly I was sort of disappointed that there wasn't really that in there, and also sort of it was so bleak. And I also found it quite difficult to follow. I couldn't understand who this Lockwood was at the beginning, and why the story was being told in such a strange way through the memories of other people. So I hadn't retouched it in all of those years. I know it's hard to believe, but quite a few years since I studied my levels, and so I thought I'd reread it at the suggestion of some of my fabulous subscribers. So first of all, a bit of an introduction. Obviously, Wuthering Heights doesn't need a huge amount of introduction. I'll include a picture here because I did read it on my e-reader. It was published by Emily Bronte in 1847, or under the name of Ellis Bronte, as you know, all the Brontes, originally published under the names of boys for obvious reasons of the time. And when it was published, it caused a stir immediately. And to be honest, I think it's fair to say that people have been talking about the book ever since. It's often lauded as being one of the greatest novels ever written in the British language. And alongside Jane Eyre, it's probably, out of the Brontes as a group, probably the best known novel alongside Jane Eyre. And it's also incredibly widely adapted, as with Jane Eyre. Probably less so recently, I would have thought. There seems to have been a continuing influx of Jane Eyre, but I think there's certain problematic, I don't know, I think Wuthering Heights is what it is, and I'm not sure whether it would have mass appeal. Well, I suppose it would have an appeal as an adaptation again now, but I think it's a slightly tricky one because of the violence and the bleakness and just the awful stuff that's in this book. So I did reread it. One of the things that struck me immediately was how much more accessible it was. I think I've just read a lot more of those sorts of novels and novels written in the 19th century since then, and that was a relief, because my memory was that I found it quite hard to read. But actually, in terms of 19th century literature, I found it quite accessible, particularly after reading Jane Austen recently, and her use of language, which I love Jane Austen, but her use of language is much more challenging, I think, than Emily Bronte's in Wuthering Heights. So I was immediately drawn in. In a nutshell, I don't want to give too many spoilers away for people who haven't read it, but the story is about three generations of two families, essentially. There are the Earnshaws, who live at Wuthering Heights, and there are the Lintons, who live at Thrush Cross Grange. And at the beginning of the book, Lockwood is coming to rent Thrush Cross Grange for several months, but in the end he sort of decides it's not for him. But during that time, he entices, it doesn't take much, his maid Nellie Dean to tell him the story of the events that have taken place and led up to Heathcliff being quite such an unpleasant character at his, the neighbouring property. So one of the first things he does is go up to meet Heathcliff, and gets a bit of a dose of his acerbic character, shall we say. So he sort of is curious and wants to know more. He's also attracted to Kathy Linton immediately, and it feels like there's a sort of almost ulterior motive to want to find out more about this pretty young woman who is living there. But then we go right back. Nellie Dean was sort of brought up with Heathcliff and the original Kathy. They played together as children, and she had lived at Wuthering Heights and sort of was in a position to be able to give a real insight into what happened and how the events played out. So I don't want to go too much into it, as I say, because I think that if you haven't read it, definitely read it. It's definitely worth reading. And I really enjoyed it, I have to say. And I think particularly because I went into it not expecting to enjoy it as much as I did, I think that helped. But I did really enjoy it. But it is bleak. But the Earnshaws, Mr. Earnshaw goes off on his travels. He goes to Liverpool, and it's never really specifically said, but there's this sense that the book is sort of grounded in the area, in Yorkshire where the Brontes are brought up. But he comes back from this trip to Liverpool with an orphan child that he's taken off the streets, and he brings him into his home, and over the years he becomes a bit of a favourite, and that is Heathcliff. He also has two more children that are his blood relatives, and those are Hindley and Catherine, the classic, Catherine at the window from the Kate Bush song. And it, after the death of the parents, there's a lot of people who die very quickly here. It seems to be, if you catch a chill, that's it, you're out. And probably it's a reflection of the time, but no one really seems to live to a ripe age, and it's quite interesting. One of the characters feels like they're around for a lot of the novel. It feels like they're a staple to the novel, and then when they do die, they're only 39. It's revealed. It feels like they should be a lot older. And I also think the fact that these characters, a lot of them are very young, particularly in the first throes of the passions that they have for each other, is reflected in kind of, I don't want to say the immaturity, but this sort of fanatical attraction and connection they have with one another. The Lintons, as I say, they live in Cross Grange, and they have two children of their own who are Edgar Linton and Isabella Linton. And it all sort of goes from there, really. To begin with, I've actually printed off a family tree because to begin with I found it a bit difficult to follow who was who in it, but actually that becomes a lot easier. I think it's just that they name the children after each other. So for example, Heathcliff's child is Linton Heathcliff and things like that. So and there's quite a lot of sort of inbreeding between the two families, so it feels a little bit tricky to follow to begin with, but you do get the grips with that really quickly as soon as Nellie Dean brings in her background. And as I say, it was interesting. I had a little bit of a look at the way the book was received at the time that it was published, and there was a mixture of those who really loved it and it was refreshing and new and challenging and something that hadn't been done before, and those that thought it was scandalous and disturbing. And so I think possibly some of that is still played out with the reception to the novel today, that some people see it as one thing and other people see it as something else. But there's plenty to talk about, and I really enjoyed that about the novel. There are no real redeeming characters in here. Even Nellie Dean and Lockwood himself, who is our sort of principal narrator, though he's retelling Nellie's story, they aren't complete, or they don't feel completely reliable. And memory's not reliable anyway. So you're talking, Nellie's talking back through events that led a long time, decades ago, and is talking in real detail about events that have happened. And obviously she's have her own bias and things with events as well. But there's real, there's questionable details about those narrations. We never hear from the original Kathy in her own words. We never hear from Heathcliff in his own words. There's only through other people. And that distance from those characters that are kind of the linchpin for the whole novel is quite an interesting one. And immediately we sort of trust the stories that were being told, but I think we need to question those a little bit as well. But one of the sort of reviews that I read, which I'm a big fan of, Rossetti's paintings, and he said in 1854 that it was the first novel he'd read in an age and the best as regards to power and sound style for two ages. But he also referred to it as a fiend of a book, an incredible monster. The action is laid in hell, only it seems places and people have English names there. And I think I just thought that was such a fantastic description of the book. It is powerful, it's energetic. It actually, even though I sort of knew, the story, it was a page turner. But it is bleak and it is grim. And I mean, Heathcliff is not a nice man. Spoiler alert, he's not nice. And there's also, as you know, I love Gothic fiction. There's a real sense of the Gothic there, crumbling mansions, people living in poverty in these houses that were once great, sort of crumbling around their ears. There's ghosts. There's sort of almost twinning of characters as well, so there's lots of sort of Gothic themes that are coming through as well. But there's also the romanticism as well of the time period. But it's not a romantic novel. It's not a romance. No one's going to want to get into a relationship with Heathcliff. They're thrown together because as a child, after the death of Mr. and Mrs. Earnshaw, they're pretty much neglected. Kathy and Heathcliff grow up together. They're incredibly close. They're playmates. They're best friends. They spend their days off on the moors together, having adventures, and they are soulmates in every way. But one of the things that really made me think about is the result of how children are treated and how that impacts on how they grow up as adults in this particular novel. And there's a lot of neglect of children in here. Most of the characters with the children don't have easy upbringings, but it's interesting. It only sort of excuses the behaviour up to a certain point. I think Kathy's very she's strong-headed. She's kind of feminist in a way, but none of the women really have agency in this novel. Particularly, it's not like Tenant of Wildfell Hall, where that there's a sense of sort of freedom and escape in the main character, albeit a treacherous one. These women are sort of captive, and sometimes real captives in their homes, and it's bleak but enjoyable. And yes, I will admit, I on a reread, I have really enjoyed it. So thank you very much to those of you who encouraged me to reread it. I'd love to know what your thoughts are, and what it is you really like about Wuthering Heights. Is it the Gothic? Is it the atmosphere and the locations? Is it the sort of sense of this undeniable connection between these two characters? Or is it just that it's a good thrilling page turning book with twists and scandal all the way through? But I'd love to know your thoughts. And the next classic book that I'm going to read, and I'm hoping going to read it in October, it might spill over into November as well, and that's Anna Karenina, which was another book that was recommended by quite a lot of you, and potentially taster before reading the much bigger War and Peace, the big brother to Anna Karenina. So that's going to be my next read. I'd love to know if you've read Anna Karenina and what your thoughts are on that one. But thank you very much for your time, and I'll speak to you again soon. Thanks a lot. Take care. Bye.